All right, we're at Tzaddik Tesam Dalaf 99a. We begin a new section of the Gemara, and it's the next few pages will be Agadata. Agadata is a broad term for the Midrashic section of the Gemara, which means it's not halachically related per se, at least for the most part. Some of it is, but for the most part not. And it's going to be related to, you can divide Agadata into two things. One is like moral ethics. The Torah, the Gemara's moral, actually three, let's say. Moral ethics from the Gemara, even if it's not necessarily halachic in nature, but it talks about a person's, like Perek Chelek style. Kind of, not exactly, but kind of like that style, where it's ethics, morals. Another section could be commentary on stories, biblical stories, biblical verses, morning, and commentaries and elaboration on that. Now this section, commentaries and morals, is closest to the Medrash itself, the Medrash Rabbah. And because it's not halachic, because it's commentaries on stories, they could be, but don't necessarily have to be literal in their literal interpretation. They could be literal metaphor of a spiritual idea. And therefore, when we learn these Gemaras, we're going to learn them on a literal level, obviously, when it comes to the stories, but we're going to, as we always have, put emphasis on trying to understand what the deeper message here is, what's the lesson we can learn from it. In following with Shmuel HaNagid, the famous Shmuel HaNagid, the Spanish Golden Era, medieval Golden Era, Jewish thinker and poet and philosopher and politician and warrior, and Talmudist. It's quite a remarkable description, but that's Shmuel HaNagid. Like a quintessential Golden Era Spanish Jewish leader, and he wrote an introduction to the Talmud called Mavia Talmud, printed in the back of every classic edition of the Talmud. In the back of the first tract, in the back of Brachas, is a thing called Mavia Talmud, where he goes through the rules of learning Gemara. It's very, very good. To my knowledge, it should be standard required learning for all yeshiva boys, and they should all learn it by heart before they start learning Gemara. In my view, unfortunately, I only discovered it well after years into already learning Gemara. But like he goes, for example, like when I talk about here different words, introducing questions and what the question means using different words, he'll go through that. If the Gemara uses that word, it means this. Like so, I did it. So when it comes to the drush, he says that when you're reading drush, when you're reading the homiletics, his exegesis, where the Gemara is extrapolating and elaborating on stories. He says there, if you can find some way that the story has a lesson and makes sense to you, good. If not, keep on reading. Like it tells you not to get bogged down in it. When it comes to the halachic part, you got to break your head until you come to the practical conclusion. When it comes to the midrashic part, if you're inclined to that kind of learning and you can take a lesson from it, good. And that's kind of the modality we're going to be using. That's the second section. So the first is moral ethical works. The second is extrapolating and expounding on the stories of the Torah, and we're going to use that in the moral lesson bend. And then the third part of midrashic writing is quasi-halachic, and that is theological discussions, theological/philosophical discussions. And they're quasi-halachic in that there are requirements for what you ought to believe, and as the Rambam lays it out, the first one to actually codify theology. But they're not halachic in the sense that, wrap your tefillin this way, not that way. But they nonetheless they have demands on the person that a person ought to believe a certain way. But they're theological, that you have to work through them in your mind, as opposed to halachic, where you're opposed to action-based halacha, where it's just do this, whether you like it, don't like it, whether you understand it, don't understand it. When it comes to theology, you have to work it through in your actual mind, so it's kind of philosophical in that sense. So this
it's also left too, because
you have to come to a certain right. But the halacha there requires you to think and to work through the process, as opposed to the halacha of putting on tefillin, wrap it on your arm. You understand it, don't understand it, doesn't matter. Wrap it on your arm.
There's also enough community for others, because if someone like a whatever course or different levels, whatever. But it means that if someone's truly in that category, then there's implications for.
There are implications towards people who fall in the category of someone who fails at the philosophical issues. That's a good point as well.
What is halachic? question for minyan and for tzibur, all kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Different status, different communities, of course.
It's still a highly contentious issue till this very day.
Yeah, because does it really see a nishba, or does it really know, and so on? That's of course always issues.
Yeah, we'll get into that as we go along, God willing.
Certainly, it makes a very practical application. For example, like a conservative reform synagogue, can you go to it? Can you even learn from something like that? And so on. All these issues that come up.
Yeah.
And can you trust their conversion and so on? Are they keeping kedusha?
Well, that's separate to giving a maliyah.
Yeah, but these are all related to these kind of these.
Because even the Tanakh Shanishba's gear is not valid, so it could be a Tanakh Shanishba.
We're talking about someone who's learned. It's a problem. The so-called rabbis are quotation marks.
I don't know about that anymore. Maybe once upon a time.
No, the earlier generation.
Anyway, let's not go there right now, but we will get there, God willing. All right. So we are about a third way to the bottom of the page. The last word on the line. There's 2 dots, and then the last word is v'ha'omer. It's like Testament Aleph. Yeah, you have it. V'ha'omer right there. V'ha'omer 99a. It's about a third from the bottom of the page, roughly, and the last word on the line is v'ha'omer after 2 dots. 2 dots, a colon, and then v'ha'omer. Yeah. So between this colon and the next colon, if the Gemara is quoting the Mishnah, as is often the case, before the Gemara launches into a discussion, the Gemara will quote the relevant section of the Mishnah from which it is launching its discussion. And in this case, the Gemara is referencing way back to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah basically stated that every Jew has a share in the world to come. And from there we get into a long discussion as to what the world to come is. And as we have learnt, the world to come is the era post the Messianic age. The Messianic age being when there's an individual who is a king who reestablishes the halachic state of the Jewish people with the Davidic line and the temple, etc. And then post that, there's the Olam Haba, the world to come, which in our case, in our Gemara, refers to Olam HaTchiyah, the world of the resurrection.
It also refers to the world that passes away.
For this part, it means mostly, it seems from the context of the Gemara, last 10 pages that it's talking about Chesed Mason. So in this case, it could be, that's true, we talked about this in the opening share, we talked about the Machlekes there.
Yeah,
but we're going to stick with, L'chora means Chesed Mason. L'chora. Even though it could mean, like you mentioned, it could mean life after death, before the Messianic era. It could be, or and it would seem from the context of the Gemara's, from the Mishnah discussion, and from the Gemara discussion, that it's referring to the world to come post-Messianic era. Well, either way, according to the Rambam, that's also souls without bodies. Ramban, as we have learned, souls with bodies. And as we learned in the last couple of shiurim, according to the Rambam, there's Chesed Mason before the souls without bodies, and what exactly that means. We went through all this. But for now, we're going to leave that aside, and we're just going to refer to Olam Haba. So Olam Haba, which means the world to come, we're going to just use that term. And it either means the world post-Messianic era, or it means life after death as we know it today, but we're just going to call it Olam Haba, the world to come. You can see the first year we gave online, where we gave you all the opinions and the different details and whatnot. Okay. So says the Gemara this in elaborating on the Mishnah's text, on the Mishnah statement. So the Mishnah said, "Va'omer ein Torah mishamayim," etc. One of the people who are excluded, right? The Mishnah said, "Amech kol tzaddikin," all Jews are righteous, and that they're all worthy of the world to come, with the exception of a few different people. And one of the people mentioned is one who says Torah does not come from heaven, one who denies the divinity of Torah.
It doesn't come from heaven.
Someone who says Torah doesn't come from God.
I think it's man-made, written by
He's
man.
a denier.
Of course, it's wrong. It's
So the Gemara is going to elaborate on this statement. But before we get there, I want to just say the following. There are a number of, let's begin with this. The fact that Torah comes from heaven, the fact that Torah comes from God is theoretically, or even practically speaking, the cornerstone of all 13 principles of faith. All of it. In other words, once we've established that the divinity of Torah, then everything else falls into place. Right? If there's the divine revelation, then you're admitting, number one, there's a God, number one. Number two, you're admitting that this God has a purpose for creation. Number three, you're admitting that this God communicates his purpose for creation to creation, which means he's an engaged God. And therefore, miracles fall into line, because why not? If he can communicate his Torah, why can't he manipulate the world miraculously to get toward the purpose for which he set out to make his world? Everything else in Torah follows once there's that cornerstone that there's a revelation at Sinai. So it's the most important cosmic event in the history of the world, the absolute most important. Even if you were to, if you were to analyze this from a sociological perspective, and to, like from a rational sociological perspective, and to deny the divinity of it, you cannot deny that the idea of the revelation is of cosmic importance. Because the fact that millions of people believe it existed already has its effect on the world, as we see from the last 3,000 years of history. People fighting over the validity of that revelation, skewing revelation to other religions and whatnot. So whether even if you deny its existence, in reality, you have to deny you cannot deny its importance and impact on this world. That's number one. Now, because again the revelation itself is such a central part of our faith, there have been throughout history various different Jewish philosophers who have attempted to rationalize their way to believing in this revelation. Now, the first is that if you are to use some rational logic, for which there are many, that there is a primary being which creates this world. If this primary being is a thinking being, then you have to conclude that whatever it does, if it's thinking and it has free will, then you have to conclude that whatever it does is for a purpose, which means it's creating this world for a purpose. If it's creating this world for a purpose, it's logical that this free-thinking, free-choice God would communicate, or primary being, because when you use the word God, people conjure up images. This primary being, creator, that has free will and thus creates, it's not compelled to create, it chooses to create. So it creates for a purpose, and therefore it's logical to assume that this creator would communicate its purpose to the world that it created, otherwise what's the point? But that's only a reason for God communicating, for revelation in general. That's not a logic for the revelation of Sinai as being the revelation. One can make the same argument for other religions' revelations. Specifically, when it comes to the revelation of Sinai, there are various different arguments presented, and one of them comes in, the most compelling of them comes in the Kuzari. It's been echoed throughout history from various different Jewish philosophers. What the Kuzari is a book written in the Middle Ages, the Middle Ages in Spain, and it's kind of like a philosophical novel, if you will. There is a kingdom called the Kingdom of Khazar, and this Kingdom of Khazar, which is somewhere near the Black Sea, so it's Black Sea,
and near Armenia, that part
somewhere there. I think it's in the Black Sea. Yeah. So it's farther east, whereas Spain is farther west, and this country ostensibly converted to Judaism. Till the United States of America, there was no such thing as separation of church and state. A religion, a country had a religion. You did not have a citizenry. You didn't have a state without religion. It just didn't exist. So even your citizenship, meaning the Jewish people's, throughout history, our status as citizens was always an issue for countries because we didn't share the religion of the country. So how do you have citizenry if you're not part of the religion of the country? And it became a very complicated thing. Sometimes it worked to our advantage and sometimes it worked to our disadvantage, but that remains the fact. So every country had to have a religion. So this country of Khazar, this kingdom of Khazar, ostensibly converted to Judaism. Historians still debate as to does this mean that everybody, the entire country became Jewish, or does it mean the elite became Jewish and said this is our country's official religion, but the rest of the millions of people didn't? But either way, the fact of this country was very curious to Jews. Was a matter of curiosity for Jews who were farther west at the time. Even the Ashkenazi Jews were not so far east yet. The Ashkenazi Jews were still living in like the Rhinelands, which is like today Germany, Austria, that area. They haven't moved. They haven't been invited by the Polish king yet to move east. So they were still farther west. So the Jews, majority of Jews, were either living in the west or the Mizrahi Jews, like in Babylonia, didn't really have much contact with this country called Khazar. We have a few records of people who have attempted to visit this country, but not much in the ways of, from Jewish perspective, not much in the ways of what exactly went down there. But this country existed, and there was some sort of conversion to Judaism. Now there was a philosopher named Yehuda Halevi, a Jewish philosopher in Spain in the Middle Ages, who used the history of this country to write a philosophical novel. In other words, he wrote a book that was like the imagined debate that this king held to come to the conclusion that he would convert to Judaism. In other words, if his whole country converted to Judaism, it's because he must have investigated all the religions and come to the conclusion.
It's become Jews by themselves?
It seems like they converted this.
How they converted?
So we don't know.
You
We don't know if they decided on their own to become Judaism. Did they invite rabbis in to convert? We don't know exactly what happened. But they chose that their official religion of the state is going to be Judaism. Like every single country had a religion. This country's religion was going to be Judaism. Doesn't mean they were actually Orthodox Jews. Doesn't mean that they actually brought rabbis in. We don't know. But we do know that their official religion was Judaism. That for sure we know. I'm missing a lot of details, but this is the general gist of the story. So Yehuda Levi used like the lore, the folklore around this country as a pretext for like his novel, philosophical work, which was, he wrote up, if this king came to the conclusion that Judaism is the right religion, and he converted his entire country to Judaism, it means he must have investigated all religions. So he's imagining that this guy sat down with his council, this king of Khazar, and sat down with his council and said, okay, we need a religion for our country. Which one are we going to do? Well, let's invite the major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And let's have a debate and see which one is going to be the best debate, the winner of the debate, and then we'll make that religion the official religion of our country. So Rabbi Levi writes a whole entire treatise, like a whole debate, which never actually happened. It's a novelty of a debate, like that's what I said, it's like a philosophical novel, in which he writes down what this debate must have looked like between the rabbis, the imams, and the priests. And then, obviously, the Jew wins, and thus this Khazarian king converts his entire country to Judaism. So if the actual debate happened, probably not. It's funny, when people read this, they assume that it actually happened. He intended it to be something that actually, like a historical record. He was using the lore of that, the story of that country as a pretext for his philosophical writings. Especially, there's more and more history because Yehuda Levi lives in the egalitarian, or supposedly egalitarian Spain at the time, which was under Muslim rule, but they were much more open-minded than their Christian counterparts in the Rhinelands in Germany, the Ashkenazic countries. So there was much more dialogue between. There's all kinds of famous debates actually. Well, it's when the Christians took over, not when the Muslims were taking over. But when the Christians took over, there was all kinds of debates between the, most famously or infamously, there's the Ramban's debate and other debates, which not necessarily did good for the Jews, and sometimes didn't do so well for the Jews. The Ramban was exiled from the country because he won the Christian debate. But either way, in his society where Jews themselves were engaging and encountering with other religions, he needed to provide his fellow Jews with the philosophical tools to counter the arguments that they were hearing from their fellow Christians and Muslims. And that was the point of this book. The Jews who were living in this egalitarian society where they're engaging and encountering with other Christians and other Muslims, that they should have a book that they can look at and say, oh, when they're making this argument, he can open the book, oh, this is the counter argument. We have the book here. It's called the Kuzari. It's somewhere in this section. But we definitely have the book here. It's called the Kuzari. Very fascinating read. It's a philosophical defense of Judaism. All to say, his biggest and most monumental argument, which he makes there, which has been re-quoted throughout all of Jewish philosophical works, is to validate this revelation at Sinai, which, as I just mentioned, is the cornerstone of our religion. Right here, it says if someone denies, that's the Mishnah we're texting here, someone who denies that Torah is divine, has no share in the world to come, because it's a cornerstone of our religion. So what's the argument he makes? Following the logic I just said, which is that if there's a God who has free choice and he is a thinking God who therefore creates with a purpose and therefore is going to communicate the purpose to the world, so we all agree there has to be a revelation. But which revelation is the true revelation? So he's making an argument for why, historically speaking, it's the most valid argument for a revelation that's of God is the revelation at Sinai. And that is because this. Every religion which begins with a revelation starts with one person having a revelation. Now, if one person has a revelation, there is no deniability.
What, sir?
Deniability. I was alone in my room and God appeared to me. Who's to tell me no? You weren't there. So as long as he can convince enough people, 3 people, that's all I need to do, and those 3 can convince another 3, and those 9 can now convince another 3, another 3, and you get the point. Within a generation or 2, you have a religion. Everybody is saying from the other person that we heard from him that he had a revelation. Did you have the revelation? No, he had the revelation. In the Christianity, it's more complex because you have JC's revelation, you have Peter's revelation, but you don't have a revelation that exists to more than one or three or four people at the time. But when it comes to Judaism, you have at least 1 million people who see the revelation. You have 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. Double that for women. We're already at 101.2 million. 1.2 million. And then children and people over 60, you're talking about 1.5 million at least, maybe even more. Which would mean, if it's made up, it would mean you'd have to go to an entire generation and convince them all that all their parents saw this revelation. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do. If I told you I have a revelation, so if I'm persuasive enough, you'll be convinced that I had a revelation. But if I tell you, your father had a revelation, well, you'll just go to your father and find out. And from all the 1 million people, at least one person's father is going to say, nope, never happened. And there it says the Kuzari is the uniqueness. This book called the Kuzari, Buddha Levi, is the uniqueness of the revelation at Sinai. And that it's the only revelation which has a historical backing. In other words, as the Rebbe would put it in letters when he would describe this, paraphrase this argument to people, he would say, how do you know that Columbus arrived in America? How do you know? Well, because there's a document that says that on X date, X amount of people all came at the same time. Why do you believe it? If one person wrote in a diary, I did this, that, and the other. Either you do believe it, you don't believe it. You try to collaborate the evidence with other records, right? But when you have a record that says that there's 100 people who saw a certain event, we take that at face value as true. Because at least one of the 100 would have said, no, it's not true. In the case of the revelation at Sinai, we had 1 million people at once. To convince 5 million people that their parents all saw the same thing is something very difficult to do. And then give them up text. You go to 1 million people, give them a book, and say, oh, here's a book that your parents saw. Someone's going to go to their parents and say, well, what? Where is this from? And someone's going to deny it. 1, 2, 10, 15, 100 people will deny it out of the 1 million. So the fact that the Torah record has date, time, and place, and more importantly, numbers of people that were at this revelation makes it very difficult to say it didn't happen. This is the Kuzari's argument, the rationalization for the revelation at Sinai. And now you understand why Torah is so obsessed, at least on this level, with listing all the names. This family, that family, this amount of people, that amount of people, this amount of people, that amount of people. They went from here to here. Why? At least to one degree, there's obviously multiple layers, but to one degree, it gives you it turns it from a religious text to a historical text. In other words, other religions might look at these pages and say, what a waste of space. In your founding document, you're putting names of people and tens of words on names of people and names of places and numbers. Like, who cares? Describe the revelation, describe your philosophy. Judaism doesn't do that. Judaism spent pages and pages on 3 times telling us numbers of people and where they were, when they were. All of that validates and gives this credence to the Kuzari's argument that validating the revelation as a historical event, in that millions of people viewed it, thus making it very easily deniable, because you're saying that millions of people saw it, and yet in absence of that denial, we should accept it like any other historical record, which says X amount of people saw X amount of event on X date. So that's the rationalist argument from the Kuzari, from Rabbi Yehuda Levi, to the revelation at Sinai, and that's all just an introduction to the next section of the Gemara, which is going to talk about the validity of the revelation. All right, have a wonderful day, everybody, and we'll go enjoy the bris.